Hello, my name's Marty Windle and welcome to the SBL Guru Podcast. We're still in season 1 and this is where we take elements of the SBL syllabus and we talk about how they apply to real life companies and real life organizations. So today's topic is about corporate governance. Now, what is corporate governance? Corporate governance are the systems of control which make sure the directors of the company act in the best interests of shareholders and stakeholders. So when we talk about good corporate governance, we need to have the right directors at the top of the organization. We need to have good non-executive directors. We need a strong committee structure. We need board diversity, and we need expertise on the board as well. The governance controls make sure the directors are monitored and controlled so they focus on the interests of shareholders and also take into account stakeholders. So we'll always have an ethical dimension. We must make sure we don't just consider making money for shareholders, but also the impact of other people, such as the community. And that's where the stakeholders come in. So the company we're talking about today is a company called Theranos. And if you watch Netflix or if you read the book Bad Blood, it's a very interesting organization and a very interesting case study on bad corporate governance. You may have never heard of Theranos. So let me give you a bit of background about the company. The company promised to revolutionize medicine with a single drop of blood. So the idea was you can take a single drop of blood and it can test for multiple diseases. Now, this promised to revolutionize the medical industry, and if it had been successful, it may have been one of the biggest companies in the world. However, behind the dream, there was a very bad situation inside the company run by Elizabeth Holmes, and it's a classic example of how there was a lack of strong corporate governance controls in the organization. Now, Elizabeth Holmes, and if you ever see pictures of her, she took her style advice from Steve Jobs and always wore black turtleneck jumpers. She was a Stanford dropout, but she had striking confidence and captivated some of the world's most powerful people. She convinced investors, government officials, and media outlets that her company could perform over 200 medical tests with a single finger prick. Now, the big companies in America like Walgreens and Safeway, they poured hundreds of millions of dollars into her company, believing it was a fantastic opportunity. The company's valuation soared to $9 billion. But beneath this impressive facade was a company that had a corporate governance vacuum. Decisions were unchallenged, data was unchecked. So let's look in detail about how they missed the fundamental elements of good corporate governance. So we can talk about the importance in governance of having board diversity. Now, board diversity can be in a number of different ways. It can have different ethnic groups on the board. It can have female representation. But one of the most important things you can have on the board is to have the right level of expertise, a diversity of expertise that can support the core strategy of the business. Now, if you look at the board of Theranos, had some very impressive names on there. Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State. George Shultz, also a former Secretary of State. James Mattis, a general very popular in the US government. There were also a number of other notable figures, and their resumes were exceptional. The big issue was, where was the diversity? Not one of them had a background in medical devices, diagnostics, or laboratory science. So because the board lacked the key technical and scientific skills, they could not challenge the strategy of the organization at the board meeting. They accepted her facts, they accepted her reports as facts, often without any supporting evidence. So what you need on the board is having people with expertise who can question and challenge. The board of directors also depends heavily on information that they receive to make decisions. Now, the issues and problems in the company did not reach the board of directors. Dr. Adam Rosadoff, one of the lab directors, revealed he felt trapped. He knew patients were receiving unreliable reports, but his concern never made it to the board. Scientist Erica Chung experienced the same frustration. When she flagged data manipulation and test inaccuracies, her warnings were dismissed and she eventually left the company. So the first issue there, lack of diversity, lack of skills at the top levels in the organization. Now, we know from our SBL studies that good corporate governance requires effective non-executive directors. Non-executive directors, they should be able to challenge the board, they should be independent, and they should be the eyes and ears of the shareholders on the board. But instead of being the watchdogs, which is what the non-executive directors should be, the structure was turned upside down in Theranos. Information flowed one way, and that was from the top of the organization, and dissent was quickly suffocated. The non-executive directors were not brave. They feared challenging the CEO, and it was a breach of their duty, which helped to sustain years of deceit. Now, when we talk about corporate governance, we also talk about the importance of having the right committees, especially independent remuneration committees to set the salary of the executive directors. This is needed to make sure that any remuneration is fair, but also is based on achieving targets and it's not excessive so that the directors get all the money and the shareholders don't get anything. Financial oversight was particularly weak in this company. They didn't have strong remuneration committee. Executive pay and equity awards were approved without any scrutiny, and there was no KPIs, there were no milestones to achieve, nothing was verified. Holmes and her then partner, Sunny Balwani, set their own compensation packages and controlled how performance was measured. Meanwhile, the company avoided audited financial statements for years. So in this company, bonuses were issued, equity was granted, yet no one on the board verified the revenue streams or the customer results. There was a lack of external benchmarking, which allowed reckless rewards without any accountability. So without the proper controls, the remuneration committee in place, this is exactly what happens. You get excessive rewards, which are not in the shareholders' interest. We also talk about a good board having an audit committee. Now, the audit committee should ensure financial integrity, effective risk management, but also some ethical accountability and compliance. Yep, you guessed it, at Theranos, there was no audit committee. So without any proper audit committee, there was no mechanism to review the internal controls in the company. The accounting practices could not be validated. There were no proper independent reviews taking place. You should remember that the audit committee should only contain independent, non-executive directors to provide effective oversight. In this situation, there was a vacuum. Errors went unreported, data went unchecked, the risks were materializing in the organization. And this was a serious issue because it affected patient safety and patient care. If an independent audit committee had been in place, they might have caught these risks earlier and ensured that there were strong internal control systems in place, because part of their role is to review the internal control systems in the company. We also know that good corporate governance requires accountability and transparency. These are the two pillars, again, of good corporate governance. The directors should be answerable to shareholders and stakeholders, and their decisions should be open to scrutiny. But with Theranos, accountability was replaced by secrecy. She ensured directors had limited access to information. She labelled questions about technology as personal attacks on her, framing them as disloyalty. The board didn't demand audited financial statements. They didn't insist on sharing information with investors or employees. Instead, they let Holmes dictate the narrative and control the flow of facts. And a lot of those facts that were being communicated were incorrect. So the outcome of that was that regulators were misled, patients received false health reports, and whistleblowers were silenced in the organisation. So this goes against the core principles of good corporate governance, which is all about transparency and a proper, effective disclosure in the organisation. So the red flags were ignored. All these issues in relation to corporate governance were ignored in the company. Safeway executives waited over a year for the promised lab results, burning $350 million to launch in-store clinics, which never opened. But it's also important to consider other stakeholders. What about the people who are getting the blood test results, which were materially incorrect? It was society that was suffering from this company's bad behavior. When the Wall Street Journal broke the story in 2015, the floodgates opened, regulators swooped in, investors demanded refunds, and law enforcement began investigating. By 2018, Theranos was finished. So Holmes and Balwani faced federal fraud convictions. Holmes was sentenced to 11 years in prison and Balwani received 13 years. This could all have been avoided if they had effective corporate governance in place. So let's summarize what went wrong. There was a lack of effective board diversity and expertise. The non-executive directors, rather than being independent, were weak, lacked key skills, and were not willing to question and challenge the executive directors on the board, which is their key responsibility. There was a lack of effective committee structures. Remuneration committee was missing. Audit committee was missing. There was a lack of transparency and accountability in the organization. So this is a very common question you might get in your examination. So remember, in the exam, you've got to take the principles of what good governance looks like and apply them in the exam. And quite often exam questions give examples where there's weak corporate governance. You've got to identify the weaknesses and then suggest improvements. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. My name is Marty Windle. If you need help with your ACCA Strategic Business Leader exam, please get in touch with me. Just go to www.sblguru.com and you can find out all about my courses. Thanks very much and good luck in your examination. I'll put a link to the website in the description of this podcast. Thank you. And don't forget, please like and subscribe.